Now, the Taycan is probably the most complicated EV on the market right now, and the math is the most dense and the most complicated. So please bear with me. I will give you a thorough explanation to the best of my ability. I know it's confusing, and it certainly took me a while to get my head around all of these different rates and measures and units and so forth. So I'll turn this camera around. Okay, to start with, let's talk about briefly AC and DC power. We know that AC power is in the grid. It's in the high tension wires. It comes into your home. Every home is wired for 240 circuits and for 120 circuits, okay? 120 volt and 240 volt. We know that DC is the only form of electricity that can be stored in a battery, okay? So when we draw the Taycan, we can start with our battery pack, and it's either going to have 79 kilowatt hours, or the big battery has 94 kilowatt hours, okay? And that is in DC, okay? Now, when you use the battery to power the electric motors, and there's one on each axle, the power from the battery needs to go and be converted by an inverter from DC to AC, okay? When the car develops its regenerative braking, it uses the electric motor unit as a generator and collects the energy in AC. Then the inverter converts it to DC, and then it goes to the battery. Okay, so it goes this way and it goes this way. So we need the power electronics in this inverter for each axle to be able to power the motor and then to be able to retrieve electrical energy from the kinetic energy of the car and put it back in the battery. Okay. Now we know when we charge the car, we can either do it from our house, my house, and this is AC, and then when we put it into the battery, we also know that it needs to go into another inverter from AC to DC, and then it can be fed into the battery, okay? We know that if we have a fast charger, DC fast charger, that we don't need to convert it from AC to DC. It's already in DC, so it bypasses the inverter, and this power then goes straight into the battery. And here's where it gets confusing. Unless the charging station is a different voltage than the car. Porsche Taycan operates at 800 volts. Now I'm going to ignore the low voltage 12 volt system, which won't run some of the, the blower motors and the other electrical accessories in the car, because that's just going to confuse everybody too much, okay? But it runs all the high voltage stuff at 800 volt, which means all those components have to run with a voltage of 800. Now, there's some stations which are 800 volt stations. These are set up by the Porsche parent company, the VW Audi Group. This is the Electrify Canada and the Electrify America stations and Ionity in Europe. They set up their own infrastructure as a penalty for the Dieselgate scandal, where they agreed to spend $2 billion on infrastructure. But they've been a little bit clever in that if they were going to build this infrastructure, they'd try to get some advantage out of it. And what they did is for the VW Audi Group's expensive cars, like the Audi e-tron GT and the Taycan, they're all running at 800 volt. And they knew that if they paired it with an 800 volt charging infrastructure, that they'd have class-leading charging, okay? So this is the VW Audi Group's Electrify Canada stations. that are 800 volt. Then the DC electricity just goes straight from the fast charger into the battery at 800 volts. That's the fastest charge. Okay, but every other DC charger out there, the Petro-Canada chargers and so on, they're all 400 volts. That means that when you take the 400 volts DC and you try to put in the battery, you need another form of power electronics. And that they call the onboard DC charger. All right. So this is a component in the car. Now, standard on a Taycan, it's 50 kilowatts. 50 kilowatts isn't much. That's the same as just the little stations and shopping malls and so forth. Okay, so if you're at a 400 volt station like the Petro-Canada or Flow or ChargePoint or anything like that, and you have the standard DC charger, the maximum you're going to get from anything is 50 kilowatts. However, optionally, they have a 150 kilowatt onboard charger. Every Taycan should come with a 150 kilowatt onboard charger. I think it's only $1,000 or $1,500 or something like that. You'd be silly not to order this option. I don't know why they just don't make it standard. Okay, I really don't know. It's easy to miss when you're speccing the car, and if you're sitting there charging at 50 kilowatts, you'll really regret not having this option. So you really want to buy, if you're ordering a Taycan, a 150 kilowatt optional DC charger. Now, if you go to the 800 volt Electrify Canada or Electrify America stations, since they're 800 volt and the architecture of the car is 800 volt, it doesn't need that step in the middle to change the voltage of the current going into the battery, okay? And that's why when you see the Porsche claims for mileage, and I think they say 22.5 minutes from 5% to 80% charge, they're talking about the 800 volt Electrify Canada or Electrify America stations, not the 400 volt stations. Confusingly, you won't find the voltage on any of the apps or advertised by the charging stations. They don't mention it. So you just have to know that. I suspect that the VW Audi Group and Electrify Canada and America don't advertise the 800 volt, because they had to build this thing as part of a settlement for electric infrastructure, and they probably don't want to trumpet the fact that they kind of tweaked it for their own cars to get a competitive advantage. That's my read on it anyway. Okay, so that's AC and DC. We know that the car stores it in DC, whether it gets it from a DC fast charger or from AC, from the grid at home, charging at home. And we know that it is continually converting DC to AC and AC back to DC in the battery. Okay, so the car has many power electronic components that look after converting one form of electricity to the other. When you do that, you create losses and you create heat and you need cooling. Okay, and so then there's a huge cooling network that runs through all the batteries and all the power electronics to keep it cool. That's the limiting factor when you're charging, and the limiting factor about how much power you can put down. It's all about managing the heat and the thermal efficiency of the car. And these electrical components like to work in a certain temperature window. They don't like to be too cold. They don't like to be too hot. And so there's these different cooling systems that try to maintain a constant temperature. Okay, but heat is the main bottleneck or limitation when it comes to how fast you can put energy in the car, and then how much energy can come out of the battery and how much energy can come out of the motors as well. Okay, so heat is the thing that everybody's trying to manage with EVs. Okay, that's AC/DC. Now let's talk about these two batteries that are available in the Taycan. We have one battery that's 79, I think, 0.2 kilowatt hours. We have the what they call the Performance Battery Plus, which is 93.4 kilowatt hours. Okay. Now, I don't have a great reason why the 80 kilowatt hour battery pack is a lower voltage than the 93.4, but I suspect it has to do with the individual cells that are in the battery pack, and individual battery cells can be ordered from the suppliers with different power densities, different energy densities, different costs. They can be configured in different ways and so forth. So I'm going to presume that this is a cost issue, and that for the highest energy density, highest power density cells are saved for the Performance Battery Plus. Okay, this is a plus battery. Okay, and that the cells for, you know, the 80 kilowatt hour battery are sourced from somewhere else within the group, and they're just not the same voltage as the really high performance ones. That's my guess. I don't actually know the answer to that, but that's an educated guess on that. So if we're charging at home AC, keeping in mind that before it goes in the DC battery, it needs to be converted by an inverter, and that inverter is going to have a capacity limit, as do all the inverters, okay? And for AC, we have standard and optional. The standard on both of them is 9.6 kilowatts, but this can be upgraded to 19.2 kilowatts. All right, so what does that mean? Well, if we go by the formula of watts equals amps times volts, and we go 9.6 kilowatts equals the amps times 240, because we have a 240 plug, the amps are going to equal 9,600 watts divided by 240, and the amp is going to equal 40. The amp at the plug, amperage at the plug in the home necessary to get 9.6 kilowatts is going to be a 40 amp service. We also know that from the code that we can only use 80% of the amperage because we need 20% as a safety margin. So if we take this 40 and divide it by 0.8, we get a 50 amp. So in other words, if you wanted to maximize the ability of the car to change the AC energy into DC at home with the standard AC charger, you would want a 50 amp breaker, times that by 0.8, and you get 40 amps to the plug. 40 amps to the plug gives you 9.6 kilowatts. Okay, well, you can do the same math and double it and get 19.2 kilowatts, and then you would need a 100 amp service to get your 19.2 kilowatts AC. Now, the 100 amp service is pretty major, and it could be a lot more expensive than the 50 amp. And you have to buy the optional charger as well. Okay, so when you order a Taycan for, to charge at home, you have your choice of the two AC chargers, and it would be applicable to have a 50 amp or a 100 amp charger. Now, what would that mean for charge times? Okay, well, if you are putting 9.6 kilowatts into, let's just round it up to 10 kilowatts into an 80 kilowatt battery from 0 to 100, that's 8 hours. It doesn't quite work like that though, because the battery doesn't charge in a linear fashion, and you're dealing with battery chemistry, which is dependent on all kinds of factors and so on, and you're not going to charge it from 0 to 100. But, around 10 kilowatts into, or 10 kilowatts into 80, 8 hours in theory, And, you know, that might be 10 to 12 hours in practice, okay, once the battery gets up to temperature and so on. So this would be, you know, I'm going to call it, you know, 12 hours. If you did it from, you know, 0 to 100. And the battery won't even take 100% because it walls off certain portions of it, but in theory. Now, the math is pretty straightforward. If you double the rate, you half the time. So then this would be 6 hours. Okay? And then if you take your 10 kilowatts into 94 kilowatt hours, well, now that's, you know, that's like 14 hours or something. And then 7 hours. Okay, so I hope that's clear. 2 different sizes of battery, 2 different AC chargers, and you know, 2 different respective amp services that you'd need to maximize each of the AC chargers. Okay. DC. All right. Because the battery, you know, is 600 volts, it's not gonna take a charge as fast as the 800 volt battery. There could be other factors involved too, which I'm not aware of, but they do have different ratings for accepting DC. For the smaller battery that's 600 volt, they say that the maximum is 225 kilowatts. And for the larger Performance Plus battery, they say that it is 270 kilowatts. Now these are peaks. They're definitely not average charging rates, they're peak charging rates. And the battery accepts, or rather the power electronics that monitor the battery and the charging in the car are only going to allow the battery a certain amount of charge for certain situations. For instance, the factors would be the state of charge of the battery, okay? It'll put more charge in if the battery's close to empty than if it's close to full, okay? And also temperature is another big factor, okay? The power electronics, the DC power electronics, are going to monitor the car, and then the car is going to ask the charger for a certain amount of power, and then the DC fast charger is going to meter it out. The amount of power that the car asks for is dependent on a whole host of things, like I said, state of charge and temperature, and also how conservative the manufacturer is by limiting it. So I think that's another topic and maybe another video, but the manufacturers obviously want to be really careful for starters. They don't want to see any thermal moments and get their car on YouTube globally in seconds probably if something catches fire, okay? And they want to monitor the state of health of the battery, and they want to make sure that they're not selling $150,000 Taycans and then spending $75,000 on that on a warranty repair for the battery pack, okay? So they're being really cautious, I believe, this is my opinion, about how much power they're letting the cars have. And the car sends the manufacturer tremendous amounts of data, and I think what they're doing is they're assimilating all this data and seeing how the batteries behave in different climates and different places with different uses, and then getting comfortable with that before they slowly meter up through over-the-air updates how much power they're allowing the car to charge. I say over-the-air updates, that's my assumption. It may not be that. You may have to visit the dealer, or it could even be hardwired into the car, and successive model years can take more. For instance, Porsche did announce that the 2022 Taycans allow a higher temperature in the battery pack through preconditioning to accept a higher rate of charge earlier than the previous models. So clearly Porsche has been out for a year and a half now, and now they're letting the car take more charge earlier. That's the power electronics in the car being programmed by the manufacturer that are affecting that, not the charge station, which is metering it out. Now the charging infrastructure has its own issues, but these are the peak powers. Now, let's go into a discussion on batteries and charge curves and how much charge you can expect at what time with each battery. And this is another area that is quite gray and complicated, and it's not the same everywhere in the world. So you really have to just interpret it and apply it to your own car. Okay, so let's discuss state of charge. Let's plot state of charge of the battery from 0 to 100% on the x-axis, and let's plot the kilowatts that the charging station is going to meter out. And we'll go from 0 to 300 kilowatts. We know that the peak rate of the Taycan, let's just stick with the Taycan with the larger battery pack, which I recommend everybody gets. It has a peak charge rate of 270 kilowatts. Okay. But it doesn't get 270 kilowatts all the time. It's only the peak rate. So when we talk about the charge curve, we're talking about how many kilowatts the car will receive at each point in the state of charge as it gets charged up. I've seen, and I'll flash a slide for you right now, that was done by a German company when they tested about 10 EVs. And you can see the peaks of the charge vary considerably from car to car, and also the shapes of the curve vary a long way as well. Okay, but generally speaking, the Taycan, at 10% will start to ramp up. And in Europe, what I saw was that it would actually get reasonably close to the 270 peak, and then it would move in a stepped function. I'll just draw it as a slope. And by the time it got to about 40, it was down to about 150, and then it continues down like that. Okay, so the only way that you're going to find out if you get the full charge rate is if you show up in the 10, 20, 30% state of charge. Once you get to 40, it drops off quite considerably, and that was my experience too. Okay, and it was the Taycan 4S that I just spent the weekend with, and I charged it in 3 different places. I went to the Electrify Canada station in Deerfoot City in Calgary. And I had all kinds of trouble hooking up. And the 350 kilowatt station, there's 4 stations, one of them is 350, the other is a 150. The 351, it wouldn't let me in. It declined my credit card like 4 times, and my friend's credit card, it just wouldn't accept payment, and I had to give up. I moved to the 150 kilowatt station, and after a couple tries, it actually finally let me charge the car. So this was Electrify Canada. It was 800 volt, but it wasn't the big 350 kilowatt station. It was the 150 kilowatt station. Okay. And I arrived there at about 70% state of charge, and I got around 70 kilowatts. Okay. I kept it there for a while, and it was slowly decreasing. Okay, so then I shut it off. I just wanted the data point, and I went to the Petro-Canada station. This was a 350 kilowatt station, but it's 400 volts. This was 800 volts, but I could only use the 150 kilowatt charger, okay? So when you go to the Petro-Canada station, all the different stations are the same. They're all rated for 350 kilowatts. But because it's a 400 volt station, the Taycan has to use its onboard DC charger, and it has the optional one. It's not 50, it's 150. So I have a theoretical maximum of 150 kilowatts from that one too. So actually from both of these first two stations, my maximum was 150 kilowatts. The Electrify Canada, because it would only give me the 350 kilowatt one was inoperative, and this one, because it's 400 volt, and I needed the onboard DC charger. Okay, so for this one, I came in there at around 60%, and I got, around 80. So that would be, I got around 80 kilowatts, and this was at around 60% state of charge, okay? But in the same ballpark. So I have two stations, one's 800, one's 400. They're both giving me a theoretical maximum of 150. It's late in the state of charge. Both stations actually gave me, reasonably similar numbers with charge output, okay? Next, I went to the Electrify Canada station in Canmore. It gave me some weird error message, but I think it couldn't process the payment either. And so, but it didn't even try, and it gave me a free session. So I think that's the reason I got a free session. So this one, it's an 800 volt station, okay? They have one 350 kilowatt charge station, okay? So there's 4 in total. One's 350, the other ones are 150, but this one worked. So the first Electrify Canada station I went to, the 350 was in op. I had to use the 150. For this one, it gave me the fast one, the 350, and for that, I rolled in at around 40 here, and then I got this curve here. And as I said, I believe that it took a while to ramp up just to get the battery to temperature. If I extrapolate, and that's what I did earlier, if I extrapolate that, that's what I believe I would have got with a peak of, somewhere between about 175 kilowatts and 200 kilowatts. That's where I think I would be in kind of reality. It's rated for 225. It's at the Electrify Canada station. It's 800 volts. I did get the fast charger. In a perfect world, I'd get 225, but in my experience, you never get, the peak rate, okay? So that's what I believe would have happened. It would have shot up to a peak of maybe approaching 200. I've also seen other blog entries of people who've managed to get that in North America, and then it slowly decreases. Okay, so that's a little dense. What does this mean when you're driving though? Well, first of all, let's think about how you'd use the car. Well, in the city, you're just going to charge it at home. You're going to use your 50 or 100 or 150 kilometers of range in the day, and you're going to go home and you're going to charge it AC, and the car might never ever drop below 50% state of charge. Okay, it's only when you go on the highway that you're going to need the full battery capacity. When you go on the highway, the fast chargers in Canada, at least, are all strung on the #1 highway. There's not a whole lot of fast chargers anywhere else. And you'll find these chargers every 150 or 200 kilometers or so. When you're driving along, you have to decide how low the state of charge is before you start to look for another station. If you want to take a chance and run it all the way down to 10%, well, then you're going to charge a little bit quicker and, in theory, make better progress from A to B because you'll spend less time charging and more time driving. In practice, you may not you may not be that risky, and you. So when you're driving on the road, I would say most people are going to want to stop when the battery gets to 30% or so. Okay, so you're going to want to stop at around 30, and you're going to get something around 100 kilometers of range. I don't think many people are going to want to drive their EV on the Trans-Canada Highway when their range is showing less than 100 kilometers, especially with the infrastructure in its infancy and all the technical problems that you find. You have no idea whether the next station is going to work. You have no idea whether there's going to be a lineup at the next station. You don't know if it's going to take your credit card, and you don't know what charge rate you're going to get. So I think, most people are going to be pretty risk averse when it comes to these for this, and that they're going to stop when they get to about 100 kilometers. That's around 30%. Now that means you're going to miss out on all the really fast charging, because the car at 30% or 40%, the car starts to really slow down. Then when you're at the charge station, you could go to 100%. I just did it, but you get right down to like 7 kilowatts. I mean, it just trickles in after that. So probably something like 80% or even 90 is going to be, if this is 30% state of charge and this is 80% state of charge. Well, that's probably what you're going to do. You're going to let the battery go down to 30, find a fast charger, top it up to 80, and be on your way again, and do that. Now, so if that was the scenario, from 30% state of charge to 80% state of charge, and you have a 80 kilowatt hour battery, you're putting in 50% state of charge times 80 kilowatt hours equals 40 kilowatt hours. Okay, so you're going to stop and you're going to put in 40 kilowatt hours. Now, when I was driving the Taycan the whole trip, I wasn't trying to hypermile it, but I got 19.5 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. Okay, let's round it up to 20, just because the math is better, easier. Kilowatt hours. Okay, and that's my consumption. Well, if I go 20 kilowatt hours, or if I use 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, and I put in 40 kilowatt hours of power in the car, well, then that's going to give me 200 kilometers of range. So I let the battery go down to 30%. I stop, I fast charge it. I go from 30 to 80. I put in 40 kilowatt hours of power into the battery. I'm using 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers of consumption. I go another 200. Okay, so that's probably what you're going to do. Now, to assess the time that it takes to put in the 40 kilowatt hours, well, we have to take the average kilowatt that we get from 30 to 80%, and if we just kind of draw a line through that, it might be something like 100 kilowatts. If everything is working reasonably, I think that's not a unreasonable expectation to average about 100 kilowatts from the 30 to the 80 at an Electrify Canada station that's 800 volts, if it's working. So that's the big thing, if it's working. Okay, so if you're feeding the car 100 kilowatts and you want to put in 40 kilowatt hours, that would be 40 over 100, which is 0.4 times 60 minutes equals 24 minutes. Okay, so by the time you hook up the car, you're going to be probably stopping for around 30 minutes, and you're going to be driving for about 2 hours. Okay, That is a 1:4 ratio. Okay, so let's just quickly summarize the Taycan math. We've got our beautiful Porsche, and we have different configurations, okay? So we could have a rear motor alone in the US, okay? And that's got about 400 horsepower just for the Taycan. The Taycan 4S adds a rear motor and a front motor, giving you four-wheel drive. And this is 500 plus horsepower, okay? But it depends on what battery you have. If you have the 80 kilowatt hour battery, I think you get 522 horsepower. If you get the larger battery, which is the 94 kilowatt hour battery, then you get 562 horsepower. We know that the smaller battery is a 600 volt versus the 800 volt for the larger one. And we know that the 600 volt can only take DC charge at 225 kilowatts, whereas the big battery can take charge at 270 kilowatts peak. Okay, so we know that the 80 kilowatt battery is configured differently, different cells. I'm not sure what it is exactly, but it cannot optimize the power of the rear motor because the battery can't discharge fast enough. And so it doesn't have the power density necessary to utilize the full power of the electric motors. And so if you get that battery, it limits the horsepower of the car and it limits the charge rate. Since that battery pack is less than $6,000, I do not recommend you get that battery pack. It is not optimized for the car. I think it's just a cost concession, trying to get the price down. I do not think it's worth it. Okay, so we've got that's the Taycan, which is just in other markets, not in Canada. We've got the Taycan 4S, which now gives you all-wheel drive, and if you get the right battery, 562 horsepower. We can add a larger rear motor, keep the front motor the same, and now we've got the turbo, and the horsepower goes into the 600 range, okay, horsepower, okay. And if we take the larger motor and we add a bigger, we have the same front motor, but we add a bigger inverter, then we get the Turbo S. And then we get 700 plus horsepower. So we can get a Taycan in other markets with just 400 horsepower and just rear-wheel drive. We have the two battery packs. And then when we get into Turbo and Turbo S, we have the same front motor, the same rear motor, but we have a different inverter on the front that is a higher output, allowing more power to the front motor. Keep in mind, though, that's only on launch control, so you have to really try really hard to be able to use it. And the turbo's fast enough, okay? So my pick of these models, what model should I get? Well, I find it hard to justify the Turbo S to get the extra horsepower, which you don't need, and only if you use launch control, which I never use. So I think for me it would be between the Turbo and the 4S, okay? So those are all the different mechanical differences of the car. And then when we talk about range and consumption and so on, I've seen personally 19.5 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers to 25 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. Okay, so that is the range that I see. And this is, this isn't hypermiling it. I didn't put it in range mode. I didn't shut off all the heat. I just drove the car normally. and that's with the smaller battery, which is a little bit lighter on a 4S. You might be able to try really hard and get a little bit better than 19.5, but I don't think realistically you'll be able to do it. That was near perfect conditions. You know, most of that was at the speed limit on cruise control. So I don't really think you're going to be able to do in the real world much better than that. And 25 is just kind of normal driving around the city. It could get to 30, I would say, in winter conditions, or a little bit worse, okay? But in the summer, that's your range. Now, to calculate, or that's the consumption. To calculate the range, you just divide the consumption into the battery that, you know, the battery storage that you have. So if you got the smaller battery, you know, that was you know 80 kilowatts, kilowatt hours, okay, and you know you used all of it, say you could, you know, you get a theoretical range of 400 kilometers. But you're not going to be able to do that. First of all, Porsche just walls off 10% of that right there. And in practice, I think you need to like wall off 20%, 10 at the beginning and 10 at the end. So you're really looking at the 80 kilowatt hours times 0.8, you know, which is around, you know, 64 kilowatt hours of capacity. And that's the small battery, okay? And then, you know, the large battery is going to be, you know, 94 kilowatt hours times 0.8, and that equals around 75 kilowatt hours of capacity. Okay, so you can figure out the math for yourself. Driving around the city, you know, you might get 25 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. If you have the large battery, you know, you're getting 25 into 75 times 100 equals 300 kilometers. If you are on the highway, you know, you get something close to 20, you know, 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers into 75 times 100. I think that's 375. Okay, so with the big battery, which comes standard on the Turbo and the Turbo S, but is optional on the 4S, your range, real world range, using 80% of the theoretical battery capacity, is going to be, you know, between 300 and 375. On the highway, where you need to stop and you're going a long distance, you're probably only going to want to go about 200 kilometers, because then you need 100 kilometers in reserve. And then that'll take you around, you know, 30 minutes or so to recharge, okay? If you get the small battery, you know, and you get the best consumption, well, you know, you're at, you know, around 325 kilometers. You know, if you have the small battery and you're getting poor consumption, you know, that would be, you know, 25 into 64, which is, you know, whatever that would be, 250 kilometers about. So, you know, the range would be, you know, 250 to 325, 300 to 375, depending on the battery, okay? So that is, I think, you know, to wrap up, a really complicated car. Different batteries, different inverters, different size motors, different voltages. Like it's all pretty dense. So I hope, thanks for seeing me to the end here and following along with all of this. And I hope that's helpful. And of course, you can apply the same math to any electric vehicle. The important thing is to get an understanding of what your consumption is, and get an understanding of how much of the battery you're going to use and what your sort of risk profile is for, you know, how low you're going to let the battery before you recharge. Okay, so with that, please like and subscribe and share, comment, support the channel any way you can, and thank you very much for viewing. Lawrence Romanosky from Calgary, Canada.